Recently, an article has been making the rounds on social media, written by a fellow named Casey Handmer. And this guy, interestingly enough, is a software engineer for NASA JPL. But at the same time, he's harshly critical in this article and others about NASA policy. And this one in particular is about Starship. In his opinion, NASA is underestimating the potential of Starship and what it could do for space exploration in the future, and is making no plans whatsoever to take advantage of it. Now, I agree with this article in many key points, and interestingly enough, this guy started his blog countering misconceptions in space journalism, as he puts it, just a couple of months before I started my own channel. Now, if I had read this very same article 2 years ago when I was very enthusiastic about Starship and it seemed almost impossible that Elon wasn't going to be able to achieve what he had set out to do, given how successful he had been in the past, I probably would have agreed with everything. However, this is no longer really the case. I've learned a lot in this intervening time about the enormous infrastructure that Starship is going to require in order to be successful. And although I do agree that NASA is not doing nearly enough to prepare for the inevitable success of this system, I do not believe that they are ignoring it completely. The fact that they've accepted Starship as their first choice for the human landing system is proof of that. But still, I want to go through this article. A lot of the points that it makes are very, very good, and some of them I think are open to debate. And the reason I want to examine this article is because it was actually written by a NASA insider. He's not providing any inside information. His education and technical expertise are far superior to somebody like me, for example. So I think it's something that should be taken very seriously. And given the extreme points of view that are made in this article, including the idea that NASA may no longer be a relevant institution and may be actually more of a hindrance to space exploration than a help. Well, if this is actually true, then that's something that would get me angrier than just about anything else. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well. Corrupt contractors who are looking to take advantage of one of the most underfunded departments of the U.S. government and an unsustainable plan that is doomed to cancellation, as the Apollo project was. Something has to change. So it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. Now, I don't quite understand why, but that SpaceX audio did not do justice whatsoever to what those three Raptor engines actually sounded like in person. I was 10 kilometers away and the sound was still deafening. The flight of SN-15 demonstrates the unparalleled progress that SpaceX has made on this project. I mean, they were hopping SN-5 and SN-6 in August and September of 2020, and SN-15 flew in May of 2021. Just a few months between flying what was essentially a flying stainless steel can to flying an actual flight-worthy vessel with flaps and maneuvering thrusters, bringing it back almost exactly to the point that they wanted to its landing pad, and sticking the landing, albeit on fire. So according to Mr. Hanmer, SpaceX is on the verge of handing NASA the holy grail of spaceflight, a fully reusable vessel that's going to be able to carry 100 tons to low Earth orbit for less than $10 million per launch. Thousands of launches per year, and I'm paraphrasing what he's written here. So that's some pretty amazing stuff. And yet, you wouldn't think it given what NASA has been saying about their Artemis plans. Just a couple of weeks ago, a fellow named Doug Cook, who was the former NASA Associate Administrator for Exploration, produced this plan for establishing an ongoing and permanent presence on the moon. Step 1, to use the Block 2 SLS as envisioned in the 2010 Authorization Act, use the Orion as presently configured, develop a new lunar lander not to exceed a mass of 33 tons. Strange, given that SpaceX has already been approved to provide a lander that's over 33 tons, and this lander has to have a cargo mode to land habitations, rovers, service infrastructure, etc., and also to develop a lunar orbit injection stage capable of delivering the lander to low lunar orbit. Why is this necessary if you already have Lunar Starship that's capable of doing these things? On top of that, the lunar mission is a fully fueled integrated lander launched as cargo on the SLS Block 2, of course, and injected into by the LOI stage into low lunar orbit to await the crew. Then the crew is launched on SLS predictably using the Orion, and several tons of margin are included for additional cargo. The Orion rendezvous with the lander in lower lunar orbits, and then the crew and additional equipment and provisions transfer to the ascent stage on the lander. The lander descends from low lunar orbits and lands on the lunar surface. The crew executes its surface mission. The crew launches back to LLO and rendezvous with the Orion, and the crew returns to Earth. Nowhere is Starship mentioned, even though Lunar Starship has been selected as the HLS provider for Artemis. Even worse, Mr. Cook's future plans essentially include a rinse and repeat, continuing to use SLS. If this were to be carried out, very modest structures at best would be built on the lunar surface with very few astronauts, and something like this ESA 3D printed lunar base, which is far more ambitious, would never come to fruition simply because there wouldn't be enough astronauts to man it. Why the hell is NASA continuing to pursue these kinds of ideas? But it works very well in conjunction with Artemis's plans. As of 2030, Artemis does not intend to have any more than 4 astronauts involved in a single mission. So why do you need a large base? Well, if all you're putting on the moon is 2 to 4 astronauts at a price tag of $1 to $2 billion minimum on an expendable rocket, this will be doomed to failure, as I have said many times. So what the hell is going on? Why is NASA sticking to their guns on this? Well, technically they aren't. Mr. Cook is not the decision maker. However, he is highly influential, and Bill Nelson and his discussions about Artemis have yet to really include Lunar Starship either. But as pissed off as I am about this whole situation, there is some method to NASA's madness, and this is where Handmer and myself tend to disagree. For one thing, he claims that Starship is a 95% complete prototype that will soon fly to space. We have no information to confirm that. The propulsion system is highly complicated and has yet to be static fired. This is a lot of engines that need to work in perfect unison. On top of that, Super Heavy and Starship both need to be reusable and recovered in order for this system to be effective and practical for going to the moon. And even the first orbital launch, as you can see here from this extremely good animation, please check links in the description and support this fellow. Well, they're not going to be reusing this booster. They're going to be landing it on the water as they did with the first boosters for Falcon 9. And there was a lot of time that passed between Falcon 9 doing these kinds of tests and Falcon 9 actually being a practical, reusable rocket. And as far as larger crews are concerned, well, of course, that's going to require a much more ambitious life support system than SpaceX has ever attempted. It's going to have to be pretty much as ambitious as the ISS recycling life support system, if not even better. Now, if all they're going to be transporting is 2 to 4 astronauts as laid out in Artemis, then really only a small portion of the fairing needs to be reserved for life support, and a modified version of Crew Dragon might work for something like this. But if we want to take maximum advantage of the huge volume available in Starship's fairing for passengers, then you're going to need a much better life support system, something that SpaceX doesn't have a lot of experience with, and something that most probably will take a very long time to develop. In addition, the price estimate of less than $10 million per launch is, in my opinion, way too optimistic. In order for SpaceX to recoup just $1 billion of what they've invested in Starship thus far, they would need to launch Starship 100 times in order to get $1 billion. In my opinion, they're simply not going to do this. They're a business, and a business needs to make a profit. I would say $50 million would be the very least that they could afford to launch Starship for, at least initially, to cover the development costs. At $50 million a launch, given that you need about 10 refueling launches in order to get Starship to the moon and back, you're looking at about $500 million per launch, at least in the early stages. So Starship doesn't come out too far ahead of SLS as far as cost is concerned, but as far as efficiency, it is of course way better. That is to say, if the whole refueling thing works, which is another big question mark. Now, I've made a number of videos about this topic, so I'm not going to rehash it too much right now, but suffice it to say that the issues with propellant boil-off make it very difficult to just use tankers in this process and may require a full-fledged fuel depot. On top of that, that very same propellant boil-off issue can actually clog up the fuel systems, making the whole refueling system difficult to say the least, if not impossible. The problem is, we've never actually done this, not even on a very small scale, aside from a tiny little experiment on the ISS. So really, the whole notion that we can be 100% certain that hundreds or thousands of tons of fuel can be transferred in low Earth orbit reliably and quickly is a really big leap of faith that NASA may not be willing to take right now. And even though Mr. Handmer correctly argues that this program, if it were to just use SLS, that is to say a modified Constellation program, would actually be twice as expensive as Apollo, apparently NASA has realized this as well, and for this reason they are deploying the first 2 modules of the Lunar Gateway utilizing the Falcon Heavy and not SLS. As a matter of fact, it appears that NASA is using commercial projects, or rather commercial rockets, to transfer just about everything associated with Artemis except for the crew. The only thing that SLS is going to be used for, as far as I can tell in the future, is going to be taking crew to and from the Earth. As far as Block 2 and its cargo capacity, I can only see that being used for emergency purposes. If for some reason you need 46 tons worth of cargo delivered to translunar injection in a big hurry, then SLS Block 2 is the only rocket that could realistically do it. In theory, of course, depending on how quickly it could be gotten ready. This is Boeing we're talking about, but still, it wouldn't require any refueling, and it could deliver almost half the cargo capacity that Starship could without any refueling whatsoever. That's an important capability, and given that Congress has already funded Block 2 development, it may be something that NASA has a need for, but nevertheless, Starship and commercial solutions are the only way that Artemis is going to work. Is Starship an absolute necessity? Perhaps not. If it ends up not working, there are other commercial solutions such as Vulcan, Falcon Heavy, and others that could transfer the necessary cargo for Artemis. However, in this scenario, it's very unlikely that Artemis and mankind's permanent presence on the moon will be sustainable, with SLS being the only method of transferring human beings to the lunar surface. It's just going to be too expensive for Congress to continue to support it. So much is riding on the success of Starship, but that being the case, NASA really cannot retool their entire plans and all of their strategic goals based on the theoretical success of Starship. Not yet. Here's what needs to happen before NASA starts taking really radical action. The first step is very obvious. Starship needs to go to orbit, but not just go to orbit. At least the Super Heavy booster needs to be recovered and reused, which means the first orbital shot isn't going to be sufficient because nothing is probably going to be recovered after that. NASA should start paying a lot more attention at that point, but it doesn't mean that they should be changing a lot because they really still have no assurances that Starship is going to be a reusable configuration. Not yet. Once Super Heavy is captured and reused, that changes everything. Starship itself doesn't have to be reusable because its cargo capacity is so massive that even if you only recover Super Heavy, transporting 100 tons to low Earth orbit is going to be a very affordable solution. So at that point, NASA should be looking at very large space stations, and also numerous companies should be seriously embracing LEO manufacturing and medical experiments, scientific experiments, etc. Much larger space stations than we're talking about right now. Now, once Starship itself becomes reusable, once it lands successfully several times and is reused, that's when everything needs to change at NASA. At that point, the Holy Grail will have been almost 100% delivered. NASA will have the ability to transport 100 tons to LEO in a fully reusable vessel, reducing the cost per kilogram of getting things to space by an incredible margin. And that should change everything that NASA has in mind for the future. Now, the on-orbit refueling, that also needs to be carried out successfully before NASA significantly changes their plans for Artemis. Without on-orbit refueling, you don't have a functional Starship for Artemis. So all of that is going to have to be a proven concept as well. I think that NASA is willing to embrace these concepts. I think that they are open-minded enough and progressive enough to do these things. However, as SpaceX works works their butts off to prove the technological viability of Starship, NASA has a responsibility to acknowledge them. They are part of Artemis. They've been accepted as part of Artemis, and they should be respected and mentioned on a regular basis as part of NASA's overall plan. And that hasn't been done enough, and that absolutely needs to change. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy my content, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. So until NASA actually embraces Starship fully and publicly, and until SpaceX accomplishes everything they need to do to prove that Starship is the vessel for the future, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.